speaker, who is Ángela Segura-Arenas, who is a PhD student in the history of sex education.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me correctly? Okay. This paper is a different approach to history of sexological science in Spain for various reasons. First, the approaches that had been made have been either specific in time, like especially the first part of the 20th century. There's a lot of research done in Marañón, in Hildegard Rodriguez. That's like the main figures of the first part of the 20th century have been really, really well researched. But after that, there's kind of a space where there's nothing, because everyone in Spain, I include myself in this, we have this believing that during the Francoist regime, fascists pretty much shut down everything related to sexological science. When you start to look into it, the truth is that it was always there. It just was overlooked for everything else that was happening. That said, the approaches that had been made are pretty biased in a way that they exclude female in all cases, like not only female researchers, but also all relating to feminism in a critical way. Like they say this was what was happening, but they didn't go further than that. With that, I focus this paper in 3 points. I want to understand the relationship between the conservative discourse and the construction of sexology as a science, because it was really relevant in the Spanish context, the way that sexology was formed to fit into a particular traditional way of thinking. I use the word conservative because everyone is pretty knowledge of what that means, but I feel like traditional works better. We will discuss it as the paper progresses. The second point is the use of sexological research to justify marginalization and oppression of women and homosexuals in the 3 figures I'm going to study. The third point is how the Spanish sexological science had a turning point in the 70s. Everything changes for the sexual science to become sexology thanks to one figure. That said, we have, as I said, different approaches to this, but all of them offer an incomplete picture. That said, I have to do a little disclaimer, because this can be like super long, like I like to be. It's also not as deep as I like to be. In the original part, I had 4 figures, and if later in the questions someone asks for the 4th, I will gladly talk about him. After all this, I have this is a part of my PhD research, is the first chapter. And my PhD research is actually not all 20th century, but it focused in the last part of Francoist dictatorship and democratic transition because of the big change in society that created. Also, because Spain is a very Catholic country, historically, we can't ignore the paper that Catholic Church had not only in society, but also politically and scientifically, because most of the research was often used to justify everything that the church was already saying. In that context, I made this colorful chronology, and I chose 3 figures. I chose Gregorio Marañón for the first part, like I'm going to say before the war, before he had to to go away because they didn't want him here anymore. Then we have Antonio Vallejo Nájera, which is like the biggest figure in the science of the regime. And then we have Efigenia Mezúa, which is the first sexologist who works with the state in the Department of Health, and also a super interesting person in general. Okay, starting with Marañón, sexology, as we all know, developed as a science in the 19th century at the end. And it started to become a really talked topic because of eugenics, because of all the talk, all the new vocabulary that was surging against all of this. And we have, in Spain, we have a whole group, but I'm focusing on Marañón because he is like the leader of the group and also the founder of Spanish endocrinology. Also, as they mentioned before, he had a great impact, not only in Spain, but internationally. He worked with three big ideas. The first one being the sexual differentiation between men and women. Then we have the intersexuality and bisexuality, and all of these linked to homosexuality, and also the interaction between all of these. Because his studies and his scientific relevance, also because his work was often used in political debates, because he provided a great deal of information to fight what was arising at the first part of the 20th century, which is mainly feminism. Marañón argued in favor of the natural differentiation of sexes, sometimes being criticized for biological essentialism, and because of that, I feel like he has some kind of, he's a big figure and everyone treats him like that, so it's not being as problematized as he should be. That said, it's completely, we can't deny the big part he had in the understanding of feminism in the first, I say, third of the 20th century. He understood womanhood as motherhood. I said here, I put it in an equal way, because he not only understood womanhood as motherhood, but also argued that women shouldn't be working because they should be focusing on being mothers. This gained some backfall from some feminists, but also a big part of feminists were agreeing with him. They were saying that obviously motherhood was a big part of femininity, and as he should be saying that. But also that argument was not only used in that way, but conservative or traditional thinkers were also using this. So like, there's a reappropriation of something that wasn't planned to be, I would say, wasn't planned to be used against femininity, but at the end, it was the same result. The same way, he treated homosexuality as a natural thing, understood as a way that it was a development of characteristics, but also was treated as an inverted, not really a normal subject. As I said, I think it's really interesting to know that he was the founder of the World League for Sexual Reform in Spain, but meanwhile, in Europe, they were arguing that homosexuality wasn't bad per se. He took it from the the list of points of the organization, he took it from the one in Spain. He was not completely against it, but he also wasn't a big promoter. Continuing with that, we get, Marañón has to go away because the regime wasn't agreeing with him. And Vallejo Nájera, which was also a good friend with the dictator, appears in this. Well, he was already a good, important person because he was already in the political field. In his studying years, he spent some time in Germany, and he was a psychiatrist. This is an important point. And he had influences of different German psychiatrists that were focused in the genetics of psychology. In this same line, he tries to find what he called el gen rojo, which in the context in Spain, it's basically he was trying to find a genetic way to define what leftists were. Which sounds pretty extreme, and it was. He tried to prove it, experimenting in prisoners from the war, that either male and female, and the female study is especially interesting because he declares that he had proven that sexuality was linked to ideology in a way that he could prove that female leftists were more promiscuous and they, in a morally reprehensible way. He said like feminist leftist, any woman that was contrary to a regime was completely marginalized and oppressed because he had a genetic proof, what he called genetic proof. In the same way that he problematized womanhood and pathologized womanhood, he tried to do the same with marginalized groups. I say marginalized because he wasn't just against homosexuals, but he was also against any kind of racial people. That includes Black people, gypsies in Spain, because they are a big part of the population. He's also against mentally ill people, against drug addicts. He's basically against anything that he thinks is an enemy of the nation. In this way, he continues this idea of the first part of the 20th century of regeneration. He's a big supporter of eugenics during a time where that was a trend in Europe. And in this regeneration point, he argues 2 points that I feel like they are very contrary, but he tries to link them. In one way, women didn't have any autonomy. They were subjected to men, but at the same time, he makes women to be the key of regeneration of the nation, because they have the duty. He talks about duty with the nation, and in a way that every woman should be having kids for the nation, so the next generation could be everything he wanted in a very eugenist way. With the last part of the regime, the things start to open because of tourism, because of economics being a lot better. And we arrive to this figure. In the 1973, Eugenio Mezúa returns to Spain after studying sexology in Leuven. I think I said that. And then he did a PhD in sexology in Paris. This is a big thing because he's the first figure who is a sexologist and is talking about sexuality. To this point, everything was, I like to call like sexual science, because it wasn't sexology. They were people with other careers and other interests talking about sexology. But when he arrives, he has that legitimation of his background to talk about it. And he explodes this idea that he is the only one who has the truth. It's a concept that he talks about all the time. That's why in the 73, when he comes back, he starts to work in the health ministry, as I mentioned before, and he works there for, I feel, 10 years or something. But I like to focus in how he founded two big things in Spain. First, the Institute of Sexological Science in 76. This is the first organization that starts to teach sexological science and sexology to anyone interested, anyone who could pay, I would say. And later, he founds the Spanish Journal of Sexology in 79. Both institutions are really important because, first, they are very endogamic. Like, everything they do is for themselves. And if you study the Journal of Sexology or any other related publication they do, it's mainly referring each other or referring Amethua. He's like the center of the organization to this day. He's 82 years old. He keeps being the center of the organization, and everything works around him and around his ideas. I focused this in the 70s, 80s. He publishes 9 books in the period of 4 years, like a big production. That brings him being sued multiple times because he was talking about things people didn't like, the regime didn't like, the censorship was pretty active. Either way, he published everything, even if they sued him, he keeps publishing everything. In this way, he has very precise characteristics in his work. But I'm going to focus on 3 because I feel they are key for the conservative objective of this paper. The first one is creating a social demand of sexologists. He arrives to Spain and he makes this big thing about Spanish people being ignorant in everything sexual. And because he has a background in sexology, he is the cure for everything. Because of that, he starts to publish books to answer all the questions that the Spanish people could have relating sexology, and he is the main thing answering them. In the same way, he talks about homosexuality and about always linked about self-pleasure. He understands it being completely normal, it being something people do, but it's never the choice. He understands sexuality as heteronormativity in the most extreme way. He gets to say sexuality could only be understood if it's between a woman and a man. He repeats this idea through all his work. And as a last remark in him, he's very anti-feminism. He explicitly says he's anti-feminism. He says things like, I'm going to quote the words because I feel like it's pretty relevant. He says stuff like women are not human when he talks about how there can be sexually repressed. He uses a lot of other vocabulary in the same way. And even though he talks about being anti-feminism, he also supports contraceptives. He also supports the rightful pleasure. So he's dividing between these two ideas. And this gets me to the conclusion. We see a very linear progression from traditional thinking and sexology consolidating in a way that always fits between what's understood as normal. In the moment we start talking about female pleasure, they are not really talking about it. When we start talking about homosexuality as a norm, they don't really like that either. But when this starts to consolidate fully in the 75, when the dictator's death, from 80s onward, all these groups start to understand sexology as something else. And this is another paper completely, because once you get to the 80s, we start seeing feminism, queer activists, progressive sexologists, and more liberal understanding of sexuality as a whole. And I'm going to leave it there. I left a few things, but we can discuss it now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this, Ángela. What a great slide.
Yeah.
It's really informative. So, any questions or comments? Yes, Herman?
So I have a question that refers back to something that you said in the beginning, but didn't develop when you said that you preferred the term traditional to conservative.
Yeah.
And you come back to conservative over there. And my question is a little bit larger about just kind of the messiness of a lot of these terms and what we might consider now to be liberal or to be progressive, depending on where we are. That if you really kind of dig into the history of sexology, there's just so much eugenics in it if you go back, and there's a lot of denial when it's history of psychology, it's history of sexology by sexologists, and all these kinds of things. So how do you, maybe it's a larger question about how do you deal with this kind of terminology where things that could have been very progressive were also very eugenic in certain situations, and how do you?
That's a great, well, I would say question, but it's a great comment. It's really hard in everything related. I usually use the term conservative because I feel it's the one that gets to people the most. But when you try to explain it, because I got the question, what's conservative for you? Like, well, it's an empty word, really. But it gets across the idea that they were, in a way, I feel like they are coherent with each other. Like if you talk progressive, you talk conservative, like opposites. But in reality, if you try to explain, it needs deeper understanding, and you need to explain it so much further to make it make sense. So like, I like to use conservative or traditional when you are explaining in a fast way, but well, in their thesis, I need to explain it a lot further. It's like a couple pages just understanding this concept of what's conservative and what's not, without falling into like anachronism, because I feel like it's really easy.
Kim?
So when you were talking about this conservative image within the 60s, 70s sexology literature, like promoting motherhood and this anti-feminist ideas. So how did it? How was it represented on the level of sexuality? Like women doesn't have a right for sexual pleasure or something like that. Did it appear in also on this level, this kind of conservative?
In the Efigenia Mezua, which is like the anti-feminist. Well, Vallejo Nájera's work in the regime was anti-feminist because during the dictatorship, anything that could relate to feminism was shut down. Even though at the end of the dictatorship, from 65 to 75, there was already groups of feminists working on the ground because it wasn't legal to work as a womanhood, for womanhood, it wasn't allowed. But in a way, when we get to Amezua and he starts to talk against feminism, because he continues to do that for a lot of years, even when feminism is really peaking in Spain, like in the 70s, at the end of the 70s, feminism was a big thing in Spain. Like they were fighting in the streets, they were fighting in the media, they were a big thing. But he was, as a figure, speaking about, in one hand, we have like, they have right to pleasure, they have right to get contraceptives, we were illegal in that moment. So he's talking in what I consider being a feminist, like you are talking about female autonomy, but at the same time, he's always detaching himself from that. Like, I'm in favor of this, I'm in favor of that, but when we are talking, I'm anti-feminism, and if women are against oppression, there should be like, not take away, but like push back. So it's a two-way street with him. I feel it's super interesting to the approach he does.
Kim?
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, so you kind of given a hint of an answer to my question just then when you said that in the 70s you had these pro-feminist groups kind of more in the streets and popular groupings. So what's happened with sexology? Is it in the university? Is it in medical school? Or is it only in this thing that you found and then of opposing groups?
With sexology, I feel like that's like the last part I was explaining from the, I would say 78 or something like that. I feel it's 78 the year. They start, feminism activists start to talk about sexology themselves. So that changes the way everything is looked at. Because for the first time, we have women talking about sexuality from themselves. And we get a lot of sexological societies being founded at the end of the 70s and first years of the 80s. And they are, well, I've made a couple interviews and they are pretty much against Amezua, even though he's a big figure. When you talk to women who were into the feminist or into the sexology field, they are all against him. Like not even against him, but they don't want to talk about him, which is really interesting in itself.
Anything else to add? Yeah.
Ángela, nowadays I think it is not possible to have a PhD in sexology in Spain. Is it the same in other countries around? Why this specificity if it is?
Well, I'm going to explain first in Spain. In Spain, you can't. There's only one university that offers sexology as I would say a course, because it's not a career. That's for sure. They have it related to the Institute of Sexological Science that Amezua founded. They are in the university, and you have, I think it's a master's degree, and you get you can become a sexologist in that way, or there's also another private institutes that you can specify in that in a private way. But in reality, inside institutionals in general, not only like college, but also the Ministry of Health, Planned Parenthood, they don't recognize the figure of sexologist as anything else. Like if you are a sexologist, that's okay, but if you are a psychologist, it's also okay. You can feel the same place. And in surrounding countries, I don't have all the knowledge, but I feel like it's also not that developed. In other places, like I feel in France they are, but I don't have all the knowledge on that.
Okay, thank you so much.